Under the pale gray light of dawn, Tokyo lay silent, a broken city breathing smoke. Streets once alive with bicycles and laughter now looked like vast plains of ash, twisted iron, and burned telephone poles pointing like skeletal fingers toward the sky. A faint rumble echoed in the distance. Not another bombing raid, not anymore, but the deep, steady growl of engines, foreign and powerful. From the west side of the ruined capital, long lines of olive-drab trucks rolled forward, tires crunching over shattered glass and scorched stone. Men in dusty khaki leaned from their windows, eyes weary but alert, scanning the wreckage for signs of life. Japanese civilians, gaunt and barefoot, began to emerge from the ruins, first in silence, then in murmurs of disbelief. For years, those same trucks had symbolized the enemy's advance. But now they carried food and water. It was September 1945, only weeks after the emperor's surrender. The war was over, but hunger was not. In Tokyo alone, more than 3 million people had survived the firebombings barely. Mothers cradled malnourished children, old men huddled under collapsed beams, and the air smelled of charcoal and sickness. The once mighty imperial capital had no electricity, no transport, no food reserves. The government was shattered, the police powerless. The American occupation had begun, led by General Douglas MacArthur, supreme commander for the Allied powers. And as the trucks rolled through Ueno, Ginza, and Shibuya, their arrival marked something the Japanese had never imagined possible: the enemy as savior. For the soldiers of the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps, the mission had begun weeks earlier in Yokohama, where massive Liberty ships unloaded crates marked emergency rations, civilian relief. Each box contained canned meat, powdered milk, rice, and vitamins, supplies drawn from America's overflowing Pacific depots. These were the same supply lines that had fed invasions from New Guinea to Okinawa. Now they turned toward mercy. Every truck bore the same white star painted hastily over a layer of Pacific dust. Japanese children watched the star roll past them with wide eyes, whispering the word they'd learned from propaganda films: Tekikoku, enemy country. But this enemy brought bread. The plan was born not from sentiment, but strategy. American planners knew that starvation would breed chaos, and chaos would threaten the fragile new peace. MacArthur's staff, including logistics officers like Major General William Marquardt, understood the scale of the task. Feeding a defeated nation of 70 million people, with farms bombed and rail lines wrecked. In their minds, this was not just an act of compassion, it was the first campaign of the post-war world, fought not with rifles, but with supply chains. Each convoy entering Tokyo became part of a larger operation, codenamed Public Health and Welfare. In the words of one aide, it was an invasion of humanity. The first deliveries drew crowds so large that soldiers could barely steer through them. People pressed forward, bowing low as they reached for the ration tins. Some wept openly, others simply stared, too stunned to speak. To many, it was their first encounter with an American soldier up close. The GIs were younger than expected, many no older than the Japanese boys who had died in uniform. Some tried to smile, offering candy to the children. Others kept their distance, wary but respectful, their boots crunching softly on cinders. The city's silence made every sound sharp: the clink of canteens, the hiss of steam from truck exhausts, the rustle of rice sacks being lifted by trembling hands. For Japanese officials, the sight carried humiliation and relief in equal measure. Days earlier, they had signed surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri, beneath the gaze of the world. Now the conquerors moved among their people, distributing survival itself. The psychological weight was enormous. For years, Tokyo's citizens had been told that Americans were demons, monsters who destroyed for pleasure. Yet these men brought bread instead of bombs. One witness later recalled that her mother, upon seeing the trucks, fell to her knees and thanked the spirits for mercy. Behind this transformation stood a complex machine of logistics perfected during the war. American supply lines stretched from California to Manila, from Pearl Harbor to Guam. Each crate of rations had traveled thousands of miles, handled by unseen workers, dockhands, clerks, and engineers who once fed divisions in combat. Now their efficiency served an entirely different cause. On the ground, engineers from the U.S. Army Transportation Corps repaired roads and bridges so the convoys could move deeper into the city. Their bulldozers cleared burned-out trams and debris, while Japanese laborers followed, sweeping the dust. In the ruins, hope spread faster than any broadcast. At first, people feared the food might be poisoned, a cruel trick by the enemy. But when the first cans were opened and shared among families, the disbelief turned to quiet gratitude. Children who had eaten nothing for days now held loaves of white bread, a sight unknown in wartime Japan. The American flour was soft, sweet, foreign. And as the people ate, the idea of the enemy began to blur. Soldiers reported being stopped by old women offering them paper cranes, symbols of peace and mourning intertwined. The relief effort grew with astonishing speed. Within days, more than 700 trucks operated across Tokyo's districts, guided by hastily printed maps drawn from aerial reconnaissance. Warehouses once used for munitions now stored rice and condensed milk. The same military precision that had leveled the city now rebuilt it, line by line, crate by crate. Engineers calculated daily caloric needs, doctors tested water purity, and translators helped organize distribution under the new occupation offices. This was reconstruction by way of logistics, a different kind of warfare fought against despair itself. For the Americans, the emotional shift was as profound as it was practical. Many of the soldiers had fought across the Pacific, losing friends in battles whose names still haunted them: Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Now they found themselves feeding the civilians of the nation they had once sworn to destroy. Letters home described the irony with quiet amazement. "It's strange," one sergeant wrote, "seeing them look at us like we're angels. A month ago we were devils." As more convoys arrived, word spread beyond Tokyo to the devastated countryside. Farmers began returning to their land, encouraged by the promise of stability. Trains resumed limited service, carrying sacks of rice under the watchful eyes of American guards. And while the city still lay in ruins, its people began to rebuild, brick by brick, meal by meal. The occupation had not yet earned their trust, but it had given them something far more immediate: the will to survive another day. Still, beneath the surface, tension lingered. Pride was wounded, fear remained, and the question of Japan's future hung in the smoke-filled air. The trucks brought food, but also symbols, the power of an enemy nation that could destroy and then feed in the same breath. The Japanese people stood in awe, but also in confusion. What kind of conqueror feeds the conquered? What kind of war ends with mercy instead of revenge? The answer would emerge in the weeks ahead, hidden in the machinery of occupation, in the quiet offices where American engineers and Japanese bureaucrats began to rebuild a nation from ashes. And deep within those efforts lay the true secret of Tokyo's survival, something far more strategic than charity, something that would redefine how the world waged peace. The secret was not just food, it was organization. Behind every convoy that entered Tokyo stood a labyrinth of logistics, an invisible army of planners, engineers, and industrial minds who understood that the stability of post-war Japan depended on precision, not pity. The Americans had mastered supply during the war, fueling vast island-hopping campaigns, keeping aircraft carriers stocked with bombs and beans alike, coordinating millions of tons of cargo across half the globe. Now that same machinery turned inward, toward reconstruction. In warehouses along Yokohama's piers, officers unrolled blueprints labeled civilian relief supply routes. Each line represented a lifeline. Each crate bore the symbol of calculated mercy. At the core of this operation stood the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, supported by the Transportation Corps and the Corps of Engineers. Together, they designed an intricate web of supply and distribution capable of feeding an entire city of ruins. Trucks rolled daily from depots filled with sea rations, condensed milk, wheat flour, and vitamin supplements. Every mile was calculated for efficiency, fuel consumption, tire wear, load balance. The trucks themselves were mechanical marvels: GMC CCKW2, 1-2-ton six-wheel drive transports, veterans of Normandy and the Philippines. Each could carry 5,000 pounds of cargo and climb a 60% grade with full load. Their rugged inline-six engines, designed by engineers in Pontiac and Cleveland, were now the heartbeat of Tokyo's survival. The Japanese had never seen such machinery up close. Their own vehicles, limited by wartime shortages, had been stripped of rubber and metal long before surrender. When the GMCs rolled through the ruined avenues, they seemed almost otherworldly, symbols of an industrial power beyond imagination. Children ran their hands over the massive tires. Old men stared at the polished steering columns, the precision of American manufacture. Engineers from the 8th Army supervised each convoy, ensuring mechanical reliability. Even a single breakdown could delay entire districts from receiving food for a day. Spare parts were stockpiled meticulously. Spark plugs, carburetors, bearings, all produced in factories once dedicated to war, now redirected to relief. It was not only about logistics, it was also a display of industrial philosophy. In America, mass production meant adaptability. In Japan, wartime manufacturing had focused on artistry, on perfection in small numbers. The occupations relief program demonstrated the opposite principle: efficiency through scale. One officer later called it the victory of systems over chaos. That philosophy began to impress even the Japanese themselves. Local engineers invited to observe marveled at the streamlined processes, the maintenance rotations, the scheduling charts pinned to plywood walls, the teamwork among mechanics who could service 20 trucks in an hour. Soon, Japanese technicians were trained to operate and repair the very vehicles that sustained their recovery. At the same time, another miracle unfolded offshore. The U.S. Navy's service squadrons anchored in Tokyo Bay turned their floating depots into humanitarian platforms. Cargo ships once loaded with ammunition now carried foodstuffs, blankets, and medicine. Portable desalination plants provided clean water to districts where wells had been contaminated by ash and debris. American Seabees, the naval construction battalions that had built airfields under fire, now worked with Japanese civilians to restore bridges, rail lines, and storage facilities. It was an unprecedented fusion of military power and civilian necessity, but beneath the efficiency lay a darker motivation. Washington knew that feeding Japan was not just an act of mercy, it was a defense against communism. The Soviet Union loomed over East Asia, poised to exploit famine and discontent. Every bag of flour unloaded in Yokohama was a message to the world. America could rebuild as swiftly as it could destroy. The Cold War had not yet begun, but its logistics already moved through the veins of Tokyo's streets. Within weeks, the American trucks began distributing not just food, but also tools, hammers, nails, fuel drums, even textbooks. The relief mission evolved into something larger: Operation Blacklist, the full-scale reconstruction of Japanese infrastructure under U.S. command. The same organizational genius that had orchestrated D-Day now mapped the reconstruction of Tokyo block by block. Units of the 11th Airborne Division patrolled key intersections to maintain order, while Japanese police, newly reinstated under Allied supervision, managed the growing crowds. The collaboration was fragile but functional. In the heart of the city, the Hibiya Park Distribution Center became the symbol of this transformation. Rows of American soldiers and Japanese volunteers worked side by side, unloading crates from truck beds under the autumn sun. One GI recalled how the line never stopped, not even when rain began to fall, turning the ash into gray mud. He wrote that the civilians didn't seem to notice the weather, only the bread. Around them, makeshift kitchens boiled American wheat into noodles, the aroma drifting through the skeletal remains of the capital. Yet for all the efficiency, there was still tragedy. The supplies could not reach everyone fast enough. In the outer wards, thousands still starved before the convoys arrived. Diseases like dysentery and pneumonia spread in shelters where survivors huddled for warmth. Soldiers later admitted that for every meal distributed, another family went hungry somewhere else. But the trucks kept rolling. Their drivers, many veterans of brutal campaigns, found in this mission a form of redemption. Feeding Tokyo became a moral counterweight to the destruction they had once delivered. Meanwhile, Japanese citizens began contributing in ways that surprised even occupation officials. Neighborhood committees organized ration queues with near-perfect discipline. Teachers volunteered to distribute food in schools that no longer had roofs. Engineers who had designed Zero fighters now repaired American trucks. This quiet cooperation became the hidden strength of the recovery. It was no longer just an American operation. It was becoming a joint effort of former enemies united by necessity. The scale of the mission demanded innovation. When gasoline supplies tightened, engineers converted some vehicles to run on alcohol fuel distilled from leftover sake breweries. Mobile repair workshops were built from gutted streetcars. Even American communications gear found new purpose. Field radios coordinated convoys across the city, reducing confusion in the narrow, debris-filled streets. The precision of military logistics merged with Japanese adaptability, creating a hybrid system that astonished observers. In a way, it was a second kind of surrender, not of armies, but of pride. Japanese engineers learned from American manuals. American officers began to admire Japanese craftsmanship. One truck mechanic later recalled that his best assistant was a former Imperial Army sergeant who could rebuild a carburetor blindfolded. Slowly, mistrust began to fade. Relief work became the first language of peace between the two nations. By late October, Tokyo's food crisis had eased, but the occupation's mission was only beginning. General MacArthur's staff pushed for long-term solutions, reopening domestic agriculture, restoring rail links to northern rice fields, and rebuilding the devastated fishing industry. Yet even as those plans unfolded, the symbol of American power remained the same: the trucks. Their rumbling through narrow alleys and broken bridges became a sound the people learned to trust. Every convoy was a rolling message, proof that order could rise from ruin. But within MacArthur's headquarters, another realization took shape. This logistical miracle was transforming not just Japan's survival, but its spirit. It was re-engineering how the defeated saw the victor, and how the victor saw itself. The question now was simple, but profound. Could this new relationship, born from hunger and humility, endure beyond the relief convoys? And what unseen forces, psychological, strategic, even spiritual, were quietly reshaping the nation's future beneath the roar of those engines? By the winter of 1945, the sound of those engines had become part of Tokyo's heartbeat. The war had ended, but the occupation had only begun, and its most powerful weapon was not a bomb or a rifle. It was the steady rhythm of logistics, discipline, and quiet determination. American trucks rumbled daily through shattered streets, lined with people who no longer bowed in fear, but in gratitude. What began as emergency relief had evolved into something deeper, a psychological reconstruction of an entire society. For General Douglas MacArthur, the mission was both practical and symbolic. He believed Japan could not truly surrender until it had rebuilt its spirit. "Feed them first," he told his staff, "and then we can teach them democracy." His headquarters in the Daiichi building, overlooking the ruins of the Imperial Palace, became the nerve center of this experiment in rebuilding civilization. Every sack of rice, every tin of milk, every repaired bridge carried a message of moral engineering. MacArthur's men called it nation building, but for millions of civilians it was simpler. It was survival. The impact was immediate and profound. Crime rates in Tokyo, which had spiked after the surrender, began to fall as food distribution stabilized. Starvation-related deaths declined by almost half within months. The streets, once filled with scavengers and despair, began to hum with cautious activity. Markets reopened. Streetcars clattered again on repaired tracks. A faint pulse of normal life returned. The relief convoys had done more than feed bodies. They had fed hope. But the transformation went deeper than material recovery. The Japanese people, long taught to see honor only in sacrifice, now saw dignity in rebuilding. American engineers worked alongside Japanese technicians to restore power grids, telephone lines, and railway depots. School teachers taught lessons under open skies, while soldiers installed makeshift classrooms from tarpaulin and scrapwood. Slowly, the act of repair became a moral language shared by former enemies. Soldiers who had once burned villages now carried timber and paint for schools. The same hands that once loaded bombs now passed rice to starving children. In that act of giving, both sides found redemption. American planners watched the change with cautious pride. They understood that feeding a defeated enemy was also a form of control, a way to shape the future through gratitude. Propaganda was unnecessary. Every meal was its own persuasion. As American food replaced hunger, American ideas began to take root. Newspapers reopened under occupation supervision, broadcasting the promise of reform. The symbolism was powerful. The nation that had unleashed atomic fire now sent flour and milk. In the ashes of total war, mercy itself became a strategy. Yet even mercy carried limits. Japan remained under strict rationing, and American officers controlled the flow of every calorie into the capital. Relief was never abundant. It was just enough to prevent collapse. Each truckload represented both generosity and dominance, a reminder that survival came from obedience to the new order. To many Japanese, that dependence felt both humiliating and necessary. "We ate because they allowed us to eat," one survivor recalled decades later. It was a truth that cut deep, even as gratitude grew. Still, the psychological impact of kindness proved stronger than resentment. The same people who once shouted banzai now lined up in quiet patience for American flour. Priests blessed the convoys as they passed shrines rebuilt from rubble. Children waved small flags stitched from ration cloth, not of empire, but of hope. In that fragile unity, a new kind of respect began to form. One not born of fear, but of coexistence. The legacy of the relief effort extended far beyond the streets of Tokyo. Across Japan, similar convoys rolled into devastated cities: Osaka, Nagoya, Hiroshima, delivering not just food, but the model of a new relationship between conqueror and conquered. Engineers introduced assembly line systems for rebuilding, teaching efficiency, that would later fuel Japan's economic rebirth. The cooperation between American logistics and Japanese craftsmanship became the seed of what historians would call the Japanese miracle. What began as a humanitarian mission evolved into the foundation of one of the world's most advanced industrial societies. In Washington, policymakers understood the symbolism. The American relief in Japan stood as proof that military victory could lead to moral leadership. It was an antidote to the brutality of total war, a demonstration of how compassion could stabilize where destruction had reigned. The Soviet Union's influence in Asia waned in comparison. The world watched as the nation that once vowed to die before surrender now rebuilt itself under the guidance of its former enemy. For millions across Asia, it was proof that the American empire was not one of colonies, but of systems, supply chains, governance, reconstruction. The humanitarian strategy also changed the hearts of those who delivered it. Many American soldiers confessed that feeding the Japanese gave meaning to the losses they'd endured. "After years of destruction," wrote one corporal, "I finally feel like I'm building something." That sentiment echoed across the ranks. Occupation soldiers became unlikely ambassadors of empathy. They taught baseball to orphans, shared chocolate from ration packs, and helped repair temples destroyed by their own bombers. In those quiet moments, ideology melted into something simpler, humanity rediscovered through exhaustion and grace. By the spring of 1946, Tokyo's skyline began to shift. Wooden huts replaced burned ruins, gardens sprouted in empty lots, and the black market turned into legitimate trade. The convoys still came, but their cargo began to change. Less food, more materials. Timber, tools, medicines, textbooks. America was no longer just feeding a people. It was rebuilding a nation's confidence. Japanese newspapers began printing headlines like, "New factories rise from the ashes, and American aid restores hope." The story had turned from survival to recovery. MacArthur understood the power of optics. He ordered photographers to document every major delivery, every handshake between soldiers and civilians, every school reopening. The images circulated worldwide, proof that even the ruins of the most devastating war in history could give birth to cooperation. The general called it the greatest moral conquest in modern times. For the Japanese, it was something quieter, the beginning of trust. The psychological transformation reached its peak when American trucks began delivering food to schools. The sight of uniformed soldiers handing milk to children replaced the nightmares of air raids. Generations grew up associating American power not with destruction but nourishment. Sociologists later described it as the soft power of bread. Within a decade, the US-Japan alliance would become one of the strongest in the modern world, built not only on treaties or bases, but on memory. As the occupation deepened, the relief program gradually faded into the background of a rebuilt Japan. But its legacy endured in every meal shared, every bridge rebuilt, every handshake between engineer and farmer. The trucks that once rolled through ash became myths of their own, a symbol of how mercy can move faster than hate. In the end, The Americans did not just deliver food, they delivered a philosophy. That power could heal as well as destroy. That industry could serve life instead of death. That even among ruins, humanity could rebuild itself through compassion and precision. When the last of the emergency convoys left Tokyo in early 1947, the people gathered along the roadsides once more. They bowed low not in surrender but in gratitude. The rumble of departing engines faded into the morning mist, leaving behind a city reborn from hunger and humility. In the silence that followed, an old Japanese woman was heard to whisper, a line later repeated in documentaries and memoirs alike. They brought food, and with it they brought peace. And for the first time in its modern history, Tokyo believed her.